All right, well, hello, class. I'm jumping in here with our sort of catch-up introductory lecture that I promised from our introductory video. One thing I learned from that video is that video creates a much larger file size than just the voiceovers that I do with the Prezi presentations, so I'm going to have to keep all of these to a shorter time frame just to make sure they're like manageable to share and things like that. So, all that is to say, I want to make sure I give us a chance to talk about this stuff and do another sort of, setup, I guess, of the content of our course as opposed to just the process and procedures. So allow me to jump into this and talk about how we want to approach the biblical text. I'm going to talk through sort of two different approaches. Sort of one is how we should regard the biblical text and sort of what the Bible is, and then a second one which is sort of how we should approach it as readers and sort of the way that we're going to want to read the text. Clearly, the Bible is a unique kind of literary specimen. It doesn't take a lot of comparison to realize that there is nothing quite like this text. It is a sacred text that is, contemporary to us, still read as a sacred document, ritualistically and liturgically in churches across the globe. It is part of rabbinical exegesis and exposition in synagogues. It is part of teaching and classes in universities and in seminaries throughout the world. So this is very much a living religious tradition. It is also the seat of so much of the theological content that Judaism and Christianity wrestle with and introduce into their own ways of thinking about the world, which makes up most of what theology is available to anybody who's doing any thinking about God, really anywhere, because formal theology, even in academic circles, only very recently and in only very particular kinds of ways is able to engage with other religious traditions, because some of those traditions don't have sort of like natively developed theological traditions of their own. So there's sort of a lot going on here with this particular kind of a text. It also is remarkable because it is a way of describing it would be that it's self-authorizing. It is a text that has come down to us in a format and in a way that no one was publicly involved in organizing, but it has come to be authoritative entirely on its own terms. There's no other book like that. Even something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we sort of discover in the form that we have it from ancient tablets. That's an accident of history that we even have that text. Something like the Epics of Homer is something that comes to us entirely through literary sort of heritage and things like that. By contrast, we have this text, which starts off with, without a doubt, the most sacred part of the ancient Israelite tradition, the Pentateuch, and is made up of parts and pieces that are perhaps very old, very archaic, but which were not put together until many hundreds of years later than they were written. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that process in a bit, but all of this is to say, we have this document that comes to us with a kind of just agreed upon authority, and it holds its role in the traditions of Christianity and Judaism really on its own merits. So we wrestle with it, I think, and importantly should think of this primarily as that kind of a uniquely sacred text. There really isn't one quite like it, even to tug on other religious traditions. I will say, obviously, you have the Quran in Islam, but which is really different in crucial ways, both in terms of how it was composed, how it comes to us, and also the ways of thinking about how it relates to God. So different there as well. The other thing about this is that it is, of course, a very ancient text. And ancient things are complicated to us because they are distanced from us in time, and for that reason, from what our human experience is. Historical difference is not the kind of thing we usually think about when we talk about difference. We usually talk about cultural difference, we talk about racial difference, we talk about the difference of gender, sexual orientation, things like that. Like, we're very familiar with the concept of differentiation among us as people, but weirdly, excuse me, we don't think of historical difference as a way in which we're really different from one another. But of course, to be a human in the Levant, which is to say the kind of whole Eastern Mediterranean world, almost 3,000 years ago, that is an extraordinarily different experience of humanity than the one that we have here in the 21st century in a continent, continent and an ocean away. So making sense of what we glean from this is going to be wrapped up in understanding that difference and the distance in time as something that can actually instruct us and give us really meaningful things to think about. One part of that is that this text and the whole biblical tradition is going to give us reasons to ask questions about what it means to be a human person. And that historical difference and the cultural differences that make it so far-flung from us is actually going to be part of what makes that such a rich area of thinking about that. So a good example, we're going to read this coming up, but in the book of Genesis in chapter 18, we have Abraham being approached by divine visitors who have come to confer with him, and they come and prophesy his giving birth to the chosen one that God had promised to him. There's this extraordinary exchange, and then in the chapter that follows, those same divine visitors go to a city called Sodom, and there they are... the story gets complicated, but they are intended to be victimized, sexually victimized, by the people of that town. It's a very bizarre and upsetting story, basically. They show up and the entire town decides they'd like to rape these visitors, basically. What, of course, we read in these stories is a series of cultural things and civilizational things that are just extremely unusual to us. Starting with how you would greet these visitors, the idea of how you would care for them in their travels, the food, for example, that they're going to be served, things like that. To say nothing of the very notion, the very idea of a town in which this kind of like corporate sexual assault was going to be normal is all very strange and all very different. However, you poke around that story enough and you begin to realize that this entire story is about hospitality and how we treat the stranger. In this case, the stranger being a divine visitor, and that very sort of ironic element of the text, because you as the reader know that that's a divine visitor, the people in Sodom did not. You seeing that happen is actually a way in which we can distill down to realize that this idea of how we are welcomed and how we're regarded is a central part of what it means to be a human person, in a way that this text is actually going to illuminate for us. So the Bible brings that ancientness with it, and it's one of the things that both forces us to wrestle with what that means. At the same time, it also makes the text unique and uniquely valuable to us. It is also a very culturally complex text. We're dealing with a many hundreds of years history of a particular religious and cultural group of people, the Israelites in Israel, and then of course through the heritage of that telling into Judaism and early Christianity in the New Testament. In all of those cases, we are dealing with all kinds of things about human culture that, like, for example, if you are a wide reader of fiction or sci-fi, you would quickly recognize as being things that are really distinct from how you and I engage in the world. Cultural, of course, is this extremely gigantic and many-formed part of what it is to be a person. So that changes things from the very obvious and the very kind of unmissable. So, for example, linguistic difference, that's going to be something that is totally there. We're going to be reading the Bible in translation, and the translation is going to do everything it can to tell us what this original language was conveying. And in that process, we're going to see some really confusing expressions, some confusing vocabulary, some really unusual stuff. At the same time, culture can be extremely subtle, and it can be part of very, very like things that really go under the radar. It can be wrapped up in comportment and how we engage with one another at the level of gesture and like facial expression and sort of emotional characterization. Like, culture is really profoundly sized. It's very small. It's also very large. There's a story in I believe it's 2 Kings, where Elisha, the prophet, has come to a woman's house who has given him shelter before, and he comes to realize that her son has died. And when she greets him, even though he's aware that her son has died and that's what she's about to tell him, her greeting is to say shalom, which is to say peace. It's an extremely subtle part of the text, and yet it is something that tells us about how grief functioned for this woman, and in this context, that we could read a great deal into and sort of understand from that standpoint, but only if we're willing to be those sort of thoughtful and critical readers who can engage that level of what's going on within the culture. The other element of the Bible is that it is a self-interpreting text. Not that it exhausts itself by interpreting itself, but it is a text that is constantly looking back on itself. So we have literature throughout that is either commenting on things that have gone before, or is conscientious of and aware of things that have gone before. The heritage of the Hebrew Bible, and very much the part of it that becomes animate in the New Testament as well, is all wrapped up in the concept of covenant. So the people of God is, this is the people of Abraham, the nation of Israel. These are people who are in covenant with God in a unique way. That heritage, it implies continuity, or sort of a solidity across time. That covenant is going to be durable and it's going to always be in force. At the same time, of course, history is very changeable, and thus reinterpretation of that covenant has to be part of the story, because the covenant that God forms with Abraham, and then is reaffirmed when the people are delivered out of Egypt, and then when they are brought into the land, and then when the kings come, like there's going to be all these different times when the covenant is going to be reestablished, and in that process is going to have to be reinterpreted. Even more though, how this text comes together also weirdly interprets itself in ways that are important. I mentioned this in our when I was talking about this, the Bible is a sacred text, but this text really comes to us through editors more than anything else. The editorial process was non-official, but it was built upon a kind of dialogue of readership and collection. These stories coming together, these being very important, but also always being aware of what was at stake in what it was that was being collected. So the text that we get sometimes is actually involved in interpreting itself in some unique or interesting way. So an example, we're going to read the book of Job. Job, a famous, almost like a morality tale of a man who was favored of God and given great wealth and all of the blessings that a faithful person would hope to receive, and then one day experiences great calamity and loses everything. The question, of course, which is one that absolutely resonates in our world today, is Job's faith a simple exchange between God and the faithful to pay God back for blessings? That's the question of Job, basically. With, of course, the reverse side of that being that when you lose those blessings, there must be some explanation through sin or fault or failing or something of that sort that explains why that thing has fallen apart. Very likely, the earliest telling of Job was simply about the experience of Job as a wealthy, blessed man who lost all of his stuff. The version we get in the biblical narrative includes what we refer to as a frame narrative. And a frame narrative is a narrative that kind of goes outside of the story and sets up the story. And in this case, it is a narrative between literally God and the figure Satan. The sort of angelically divine figure from the Hebrew Bible, who's usually there to test or prove those who are in God's favor. And in this case, Job is the subject of Satan's tempting. And so basically Satan poses the question, and we get in that frame narrative an explanation for what's actually going on, which is that God is proving Job's faithfulness by allowing Satan to test Job's faith by taking away all of these blessings. So, interestingly, what that tells us is not, well, let me put it this way, a very unhelpful and not very interesting way of asking questions about this text would be to say, oh, this story is a lie about God because some other person added to it later. That's a very uninteresting approach, because those concerns about the veracity or the reality of God are really secondary to what the story is actually reflecting on and talking about. A more interesting set of questions is the idea that the earlier version of that story, where the explanation about God and Satan wasn't included, was so uncomfortable to those who read it that they felt they needed to include this narrative to make sense of it. And that suddenly is a really set of interesting questions. Like, what is the concern? What was the anxiety? Was it the anxiety on the part of Job's faithfulness? That Job's faithfulness didn't mean anything unless this frame narrative showed that it was there to prove these things about God? Was it the idea of Job's insolence? And they wanted to give a better explanation for why Job was being the way that he was. So there's a whole set of really interesting questions about that. But so at all times, this text requires you to look back unto itself in interesting and thoughtful ways. Many other examples, we'll talk about them, I'm sure, throughout the semester. The final thing to note, of course, is also the Bible is also a text among texts. And I say that to say there are places where that sacredness that I was started with is primary and has to be respected without delineation. If you're in a church and the text is being read ceremonially and ritually, that is the operative sort of paradigm for this text. It is a sacred speaking of God, and that is how it exists in that context. But we're not in a church, and we're not doing that work. We're in a university, and we are all critical thinkers, and we don't bring our faith claims with us into the critical work that we do, which means we get to ask this text all kinds of really critical and difficult questions. Nothing is out of bounds here. We can poke back on everything that's going on, and one thing I can say that I think is a really interesting and durable part of the biblical heritage as a whole is that it's actually a very it's a well-poked document. In fact, I would say the theological tradition around the Bible is one of the most sort of lengthily and sort of returned to piece of critical literature in human history. Like, nothing else has been dissected and pulled apart quite like the Bible has. And that's all good. That's all appropriate. That's all totally fine. That's one of the ways we're going to want to ask questions about this text. We're going to want to pull it apart. We're going to want to realize that, Moses probably didn't write this, and David probably wasn't this historical person that this text is describing to us. We're going to see human fingerprints all over it. We're going to want to ask questions about those things and the motivations and the biases that are all in place. So those are some ways to think about what the Bible is, because it really is a document that, especially if you haven't read it yet, like if this is your first time to really engage in a meaningful way, important to be able to call it what it is, and at the same time not let that keep you from asking really good questions. The other side of this for us is not just what is the Bible, but also sort of like what approach and what ways of reading are we bringing to the text. And now there's a whole other set of questions. Because one thing to note is that how this text has been read is a huge part of the interpretive history, certainly of Judaism and Christianity, but also in sort of like the formation and development of these religious traditions and how they've impacted the cultures around them. And there's some things to note, especially about ancient readers. In fact, some of this I'm getting from some of the introductory chapters. This is a very fantastic book. This is James Kugel's How to Read the Bible. He's giving sort of a gloss of the Hebrew Bible, and does a really good job of kind of weaving some of the questions that I'm pointing to into a kind of account of what's going on in the text themselves. But he draws attention to the fact that this is a text that has been interpreted really since it arrived as a document that could be read. And he finds it really helpful to point out the ways in which this text has always been read sort of in a not just straight on sort of a way. So one of the things that he notes is that early interpreters, early readers who were doing the work of interpretation, brought with them some assumptions that can be helpful for us to be aware of as we think about the assumptions we bring with us to a text like this. So, for example, one of the assumptions that these early interpreters brought with them was the idea that there would be cryptic meaning in the scriptures themselves. So, a character's example of this is the very learned Jewish interpreter Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria is living in the 1st century CE. He's probably a contemporary of New Testament writers. And he is going to assume out of hand that whatever is going on in the Hebrew Bible that is sacred and sort of worthy of our attention is some kind of an allegory to other things in the universe. So the stories that we have are actually there to tell us about other things, and that the work of an interpreter is to pull out that meaning from this a very highly allegorized set of stories. At the same time, there are going to be other readers who are more mystically minded, who thinks that meaning comes more from sort of like prayerful illumination and the idea that the Holy Spirit is going to come in and give you the secret meaning of the text. At the same time, even though these texts are going to be so concerned about cryptic meaning, they're also going to believe out of hand that this text cannot have contradiction in it, at least when we're getting into like the most essential questions. And that's going to force them to do the work of interpretation in a way that always creates room for explanations, even when they're outlandish, for areas in the text that are at issue with one another. An example of this is, the sequence of events in the Gospels. We have 4 different Gospel accounts in the New Testament. They are frequently overlapping in terms of stories that they're being told, but there are subtle and crucial differences at times that are put the stories out of order or imply things that are happening at times that couldn't all be happening at the same time. For a very long time, interpreters did a great deal of work to smooth those inconsistencies out, because there was a belief that, again, there could not be contradiction in these texts. So for interpreters, that was an important part of what they thought they had to be doing with this literature. Many of these early interpreters also believed that this text had to be instructional, like it had to be teaching us something. And the thing it had to be teaching us was about how to live our moral lives. So you can, of course, imagine how that's going to have a huge impact on how this text is read for literally centuries afterward. So much so that today, that's probably one of the main ways in which people think of the Bible as meaningful, is that it is there to tell us how to live our lives, or that it has something to say to that point. These early interpreters also assumed that this text was divine, that it was the product of divine inspiration in some profound way that made it truthful in a way that no other writing could be. So, that all of these assumptions, everything I'm describing up to this point, this is how people have approached this text from the very earliest ages. There is no version of reading the Bible where anyone assumed it was a straightforward, non-interpretable document. So, of course, for ourselves, as critical readers in the 21st century, we have to then also be aware of how we're reading the text and the assumptions that we bring with us. So these are just some things I think we should think about as we wrestle with, again, these traditions that go before us. For one thing, and I talked about this in terms of our distance from these writers, I think we have to acknowledge the many ways in which we are very distant from both the writers of the primary text that we're reading, but then also when those writers are also interpreters of stuff that goes back before them. Like, we have to be aware of all of the different dimensions of that. So a fantastic example is we're going to be spending a decent amount of the semester reading some of Paul's letters from the New Testament. Paul is extremely influential. He's one of the most influential single figures in the entire biblical tradition, so much so that one way of looking at the New Testament is to say that Paul's version of Christianity is on the table or sort of up for discussion, and everyone is either agreeing with Paul or agreeing with part of Paul, or they're disagreeing with him and trying to promote a different point of view. At the same time, everything Paul is doing is interpretation of what he thinks the Hebrew Bible is really all about. So we have a writer who we have to make sense of on his own terms, whose entire way of making sense of himself is to do the work of interpreting something that goes before him. So as you can imagine, we have to be very, very conscientious of what it is that we're reading and how those texts are involved in interpretive projects that really go beyond themselves. Even in earlier texts, like when we're looking at how Genesis is put together, we're going to be, seeing a narrative that gets put together in a certain way, but very quickly, just doing a little scratching of the surface, we're going to find that there's multiple traditions that are not always in agreement with each other, and they're kind of the hostility or the incongruity is always sort of there, and we're going to have to sort of see those things as part of how an editorial tradition made decisions to make this tradition kind of work. So we have to bring that awareness to the text when we read it. I have talked about the redactors or editors a number of times now, and I think that we have to be very conscientious of them and their motivations. These are the sort of anonymous people who are involved in the biblical text, and they're always involved throughout the Hebrew Bible. Somebody is collecting things together and putting them into something that is workable and readable. The version of the Hebrew Bible that we have probably comes together in some fashion during the Babylonian exile of Judah. So this is in like the 6th century BCE, even while some of the texts in that tradition are perhaps hundreds and hundreds of years older than that, or even 1,000 years older than that. So we're never actually seeing a text that's written in the sense that one person sat down and wrote, from beginning to end, and that was their entire story. Instead, what we're always seeing are things that have been cobbled together and brought together. So examples, there are very obvious ones. We have 150 Psalms in the Hebrew Bible. Well, a person named the psalmist did not sit down and write 150 Psalms in order. No, of course, they're being collected from different people. It's a whole poetic tradition, and some authors became associated with David. Maybe David himself is part of those poetic traditions, but then an editor took them and brought them into conversation with other psalmic writers, and then put a collection together, and now that becomes part of the text. We have something like the prophet Isaiah, which, if you look at the text itself, looks like this monolithic, extremely developed prophetic piece of literature, but is perhaps 3, 4, or maybe even 5 different iterations that have been kind of brought together through an editorial process. So we really have to be aware of that this is going to be so much the process of bringing something together. The people who are involved in this are cultural, they're artificers, they're people who are bringing and trying to save and hold on to as much culture as they can get their hands on. So I think we have to take that process seriously and see that as what is making up the work of the biblical text. My hope is that by doing that, for one thing, we'll become very compassionate to that process, in the sense of understanding that this probably wasn't an easy thing to do, and it probably required a great deal of effort on the part of these people who are just trying to preserve traditions. I should have two related things that I think are important. And how do I want to say this exactly the right way? The Bible is full of fraught religious ideas. How could it not be, right? This is a formative text for two very, very important and influential religious traditions in the world. Of course, this text is going to have a lot of connection to things that can be very real in people's lives. This is a text that has damned people based on its moral teachings. It has marginalized people. It has justified horrible institutions, including slavery, including the marginalization and subjugation of women in explicit ways. This is a text that has all kinds of things that can be anxious and dicey things for us as readers to read today, because we bring some of those things with us, depending on what our own experience and identities are. Everything about the feelings we could have about that are valid. Absolutely. If you are a queer person, if you are a person of color, if you are bringing any of those experiences with you into this text, and you see things like the justification of slavery, for example, or you read a text that says literally that women should be silent and are not permitted to speak, but instead must go home and learn from their husbands, things like that. Any feelings you have there, of course, are completely valid. And that validity should be something you bring with you and that you carry with you in ways that you've sorted out for yourself. But what I will say is that bringing those things with you in a way that tints how you look at this text is not going to be as productive as maybe it feels. In other words, if you come to this text with unresolved feelings, it's going to be very hard to see past the sort of anger and those elements. So, for example, slavery is a good example for this. The Bible has a heritage in America of being used to justify the specific enslavement of African Americans in American culture. Like, it has that exact specific history. Of course it does. There are oodles of examples you could point to. This is part of that tradition. At the same time, this book was not written to justify those later events. And in the same way, this text, which very much reflects the sexual and gendered mores of its time, was not written with the goal that 2,000 years later it still would be used to enforce these kind of gendered paradigms. So I say all of that to say that, I think an important thing for us to do is to be aware of what we're bringing with ourselves, and to try to work through those things independently of what we're asking of the text itself. And I'm not saying that because I think we should let the text off. It's actually just the opposite. It's that in order for us to ask the best critical questions, I think we have to kind of modulate and understand what's really going on there. Because then we can actually ask some really, really interesting questions, and we can get to some really, really interesting ideas, including some of the ways in which some of what might be going on in the text actually has very little to do with how it's used. For example, in contemporary discourse around like sexual orientation or something like that. We can talk more about that sort of later, but as a good example, we have a very different idea about sexual orientation in 2021 than anyone in antiquity had, and to make an absolute comparison between this text and what's going on now is usually a mistake of people in the 21st century, to assume the Bible is just transferable that way. But in order to get to those insights and to see that difference, you have to be able to look at the Bible with kind of a sense of aloofness or a sense of separation. So that's one thing I want to sort of bring, and that has to do with like the emotional and spiritual elements of this thing. If you have those unsettled feelings, it's like you want to honor them in their place, but you also want to be able to think freely beyond them as well. The other side of this has to do with a paradigm of thinking about the Bible really since the Enlightenment, which is this idea of like demythologization, or kind of an embarrassment that the Bible is a text that lives in a world full of divinities and spirits and angels and divine action and miracles and other kinds of things like that. And for a very long time, the very fact of that made people believe that the only way to treat the Bible seriously was to somehow denature that aspect of the text, and you would sort of be able to lift out of that process. You'd get to some kernel truth or something that was valid in there. This especially gets part of biblical conversations today when I see sort of atheists on the internet arguing about the Bible, almost always with like that class of people who care about the Bible who are like least they're going to be the people who are most argumentative to those people who are decrying these issues of the Bible's archaicness. What I basically want to say is that there's not much to do there anymore. No one is unaware that the Bible is part of an ancient and scientifically naive period of world history. And with the exception of those who are coming with extraordinary faith commitments, and those faith commitments, I assure you, are not like they don't live in the world of like reasoned discourse where you could like talk someone out of them or something like that. So there's really no help by, for example, I'm trying to think of an example of this. There's not much good that can come of the idea of like arguing that it would be impossible for the Sea of Reeds to be separated by a wind that allowed Moses and the people of Israel to escape the Egyptians, or what have you. Or conversely, to say I'm going to prove through astronomical observation and history that the sun was held in the sky like it describes in the book of Judges, or whatever it happens to be. The biblical material is not... It's completely removed from a modern scientific way of looking at the world. And its point of view about the world is not resolvable to a contemporary scientific point of view about it. So, for a long time, that was just like a really sticky area that everybody got caught up in. And I think in our, to use that terrible term, postmodern world, it is way better for us to just kind of move past all those things. Because there's still people who have found and are engaged in some really creative ways of thinking with this text. I'll talk about them more. But if we're going to get to that level, if we're going to be able to sort of engage at that point, it's going to be necessary to kind of like not worry and sweat the details so much. That you also have to kind of just grant perspective to this text, that this is a supernatural milieu, and that's how people saw the world, and that's the concerns that they bring with them when they told the stories the way that they did. So my personal thought is that you want to kind of leave behind the argumentative and kind of disbelieving part of yourself, and a little bit like when you're reading, I don't know, sci-fi or certain kinds of fantasy fiction, you kind of have to just give in to the worldview a little bit. In order to be able to just facilitate yourself to understand what's really going on there, because whatever depth there is to get to, if there's some other truth being communicated, it entails that you get past the details. Just like if you're watching the original Star Wars trilogy, if there's something truthful that Yoda is going to tell Luke Skywalker, you can't spend your entire time only thinking about the impossibility of creating a sustained laser sword or whatever. Like that's just not... That's going to keep you narrow and focused away from what else there is to talk about. And as a final thing to note, another thing I'm really inviting us to do, like through our music project and through some of our reading reflections, is to see that for really all kinds of readers, both from specific religious traditions, but also just beyond that in literary and poetic and philosophical spheres, the Bible is a thing you get to think with and alongside in really creative ways. I really hope I have a chance to showcase some of these as we're going through. A few examples come to mind. I think of the poem "The Second Coming" by Yeats. W.B. Yeats is a beautiful poem that spawns 1,000 other book titles are actually usually taken from this poem. It's crazy how many of them are. But it's saturated in apocalyptic thinking and imagery from the Bible. That phrase "slouching towards Bethlehem" is from there. It's where that phrase "things fall apart, the sinner cannot stand" comes from. And Yeats is thinking about, ironically, a world where phantasaical thinking, and specifically the kind of fascistic movements in Europe in the early part of the 20th century are making him anxious about what this all means for humanity. But we also have even deeper engagements with full stories. So, for example, Soren Kierkegaard, the 19th century philosopher, spends years thinking about his own experience of faith through the lens of the sacrifice of Isaac, the story from Genesis that we'll read. So much so that he has an entire philosophical reflection on this story. That is one that really entails a serious and engaged reading of that text. If you didn't have Genesis in front of you reading Kierkegaard, I don't think it would make any sense. You really, really need it to understand. And then we see this also, like, for example, in even things that are really far away from like a faith claim, and yet are still really profound as expressions of and reflections on what it means to be a human person. So the example I always think of is Salvador Dali, this extraordinary 20th century painter and artist. Who he's the one, if you've ever seen the melting clocks, he's the famous melting clock artist. But in a mature period of his life, he decides to actually engage a subject area that was very common for classical painting, which is a passion crucifixion scene. There's scores of them throughout Western art history. Why wouldn't he try one? However, through his own reading of the biblical text and his own very, very unique artistic vision, Dali has the gumption and the insight to paint this crucifixion scene from the top down. I encourage all of you, my video is already too long, I can't put more images and make the file size any longer, but please go just Google Salvador Dali and put like crucifixion or crucifixion scene. And you'll see the image, and it's literally God's view, but it, almost simplistically depicted. Like, it's not God like up in the starry heavens with a big white beard. It's almost as if God was just like leaning over and just peering down and seeing Jesus on the cross. Salvador Dali is not a explicitly or like fanatically religious person, and yet this was part of his own reflection on what was going on here, and wanted to sort of capture the idea of the observation of this moment of profound, definitive decision making on the part of Jesus to drink the cup, as it were, that was placed before him, and to tell it by painting it in this way is an extraordinary reflection on the text. That to me is the best version of this for us. Like, that's the cool level. That's the meaningful level. That's the level that has anything that's interesting to say. Is one where we can take the text seriously, critically engage with it in all of the ways. Bring everything with us. Every concern, every negative thought that we want to throw at it, and put the text through its paces. At the same time, bring every creative idea that we have to kind of see what else we can come up with. And as a result, we get to refresh this text, refresh what it means, and hopefully come up with ways to allow ourselves to flourish within its pages in whatever way that is meaningful to us, both as secular readers, as sacred readers, and with whatever else we bring with us. To me, there's a great grand sort of a happy place to end up with this kind of a thing where the validity of what we get out of the text comes from what we bring to it. And that's something I'm absolutely open ears and fascinated, depending on your own backgrounds and whatever else you have to say. I want to hear what you think and what you can bring and make sense out of this text. But what I hope I've definitely set up is that this isn't like cracking open just your standard novel or something from like classics of Western literature or something. This is a text with some unique dimensions and some very unusual textures and things, and we're just going to have to be attentive to those as we go through and read it. Starting next week, of course, I will have subject-specific discussions. It will probably not be like this with me talking at you. It's going to be more of a Prezi lecture with voiceover, so content will be there and it'll be easier to see. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to jumping into the text.